Hey everyone, just felt like making a short, fun video today about some of my favorite protagonists that I have read. I published a video a few months back discussing my favorite fantasy series that I've read, and I thought it would be interesting to also delve into some of my favorite characters. Before I get into it, I want to make two important points. One, this is in no particular order, mainly because I came up with the top 5 and I like them all so much that I couldn't really bring myself to place them. They're all wonderful characters in my opinion. And two, I'm going to try my best not to give spoilers. What I might do is start off without any spoilers, but then at a certain point in the description of each character say, okay, I'm going to get into some, just so you can skip ahead if you don't want spoilers. Obviously, I highly recommend you read the books that these characters are in. They're all incredible series. And so if you haven't read them, skip the spoiler part so I don't ruin anything for you. Without further ado, here are my 5 favorite fantasy protagonists. So the first protagonist I want to discuss is Kvothe from the Kingkiller Chronicle by Patrick Rothfuss. So the Kingkiller Chronicle, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a trilogy, the first 2 books of which are available. The third one has not yet been written. The first book is my favorite book of all time, and that's called The Name of the Wind. The format of the book is basically an older man named Kvothe is retelling his life's story, his very infamous life story, to a man named the Chronicler, whose job it is to record people's stories, right? He tells the Chronicler, oh, my life story will take 3 days to tell. And Kvothe is really Kvothe, though he has changed his name to remain anonymous. So he's telling his life story, and basically you learn that Kvothe, as a young person, was a part of a troupe called the Ademaru. It's a group of people who basically travel around. They usually have a patron, and they perform, right? There's a traveling troupe of performers. His mother and father were both singers, actors, etc. And it becomes very clear from a young age that Kvothe is incredibly bright. He's a great musician, just picks up things really quickly, has an excellent memory, and he eventually gets introduced to magic. Different forms of magic exist in this world, but specifically one called sympathy, and then other fields of study like different sciences and mathematics and stuff like that. He eventually attends what's called the university, which is where people go to study magic and other advanced fields of study. Without getting too much into the plot of the story, Kvothe is one of my favorite protagonists because, at least for me, being a musician, he's incredibly relatable. A lot of the story kind of revolves around him being a poor musician trying to pay for school, which, as I mentioned in my series review video, is something that I can very directly relate to, and a lot of my friends who I've recommended the book to feel the same way. A couple other reasons, though, that I really love Kvothe. You get to really see very pointedly through his eyes. The whole story is about him. And a lot of the fantasy series I read nowadays have larger casts, something like A Song of Ice and Fire or a lot of Brandon Sanderson's books, or even ones that don't have maybe 20 viewpoint characters, but even 4 or 5. You're still getting a lot of information from different places, which can be very interesting, but it is really cool to see something where you're just getting it through one point of view done so well. Kvothe is a really relatable character, I think, despite the fact that he is incredibly bright and has a mind like a steel trap. He is obviously a complicated person, especially because in the beginning of the story, he's young. You know, when we first see him at the university, he's maybe 15, 14 years old, something like that. And while he's incredibly bright, he makes a lot of stupid mistakes and does a lot of things that he eventually regrets. I just find him personally so relatable. I think he is not only a good person who cares about others, but he's got a bit of an ego. He can be a bit of a trickster. He can be a bit of a pain in the ass. One thing I like to say when I explain Kvothe to people is that Kvothe is like he's a little shit, kind of. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that on YouTube, but he's a pain in the ass, you could say. And I kind of like that. I think it's kind of funny to have a character who's a genuinely good person who's caring, but also a little bit like stubborn and rough around the edges. I think that makes for an interesting character to read. So for any of you who have not read The Kingkiller Chronicler, I highly recommend it. Kvothe is such an engaging character. I love him so deeply, and that makes him probably my favorite protagonist. All right, the next protagonist I want to talk a little bit about is Kaladin Stormblessed from the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. For any of you who've read Brandon Sanderson's works before, he is so wonderful with character development. From the Stormlight archive to the Mistborn trilogy to several of his standalone novels that I've read, just he creates such believable, real, deep characters, which is something that modern fantasy is doing really well as a whole, and he is at the forefront of that. So there's a lot of incredible characters in the Stormlight archive. Many people I speak to probably wouldn't name Kaladin as one of their favorites. He's a bit of an obvious choice, I would say, because this series has a large cast of characters, similar to something like Game of Thrones, so for those of you who are familiar with that. Large cast of viewpoint characters. Kaladin is the primary focus of the first book of the series, called The Way of Kings. How the books are formatted, basically, they're very long books, and each of the 4 books that are currently out, there's going to be 5 in the Era 1 Stormlight archive, and then another 5 later. Each of the books basically tells the story as it's happening in real time, but includes flashbacks for one character. So in the first book, The Way of Kings, which is incredible, you're getting the story in real time, moving forward from the perspective of Kaladin, the other characters, Dalinar, Shallan, Yasna Kholin, etc. But you're getting these flashbacks relating to Kaladin's life and showing how he ended up where he ended up, why he is the way he is, right? So you kind of jump right in with Kaladin, and you can see this person's incredibly troubled. He deals with a lot of emotional turmoil, and you're not entirely sure why. So the format of that first book does an excellent job of showing you why over time, which kind of helps you build a really strong relationship with the character. Kaladin, I would say, is kind of like the consummate hero. It's kind of like Brandon Sanderson took, what does a hero look like? And in some ways, he turned it on its head. He really addresses the fact that Kaladin deals with depression, with PTSD, with extreme anxiety, and he does that in a way that I think is really, really deep. He addresses those issues in Kaladin in a way that doesn't feel like he's just throwing it on there just to make the character more interesting. He actually is considered, how would he act if he had depression? How would this affect him? It's very deep, very well thought out. So in that way, he's not necessarily a typical hero, but in many other ways he is. He's kind of that person who started from the bottom, you could say, small village, difficult lifestyle. He was actually studying under his father to be a surgeon, but then circumstances just keep arising that allow him to, overcome different obstacles and become more and more powerful and more impactful to the world around him. He's one of those characters where in the 11th hour, he, miraculously is able to step up and do something incredible, which is just such a good feeling, especially when it feels earned. So Kaladin is an incredibly powerful character. He has a really great grasp of the magic that exists within the Stormlight archive. And the fact that he deals with emotional turmoil and strife just makes you feel more connected to him, because as you read through the series, he's capable of doing anything. He's overcome so much in his life, not only because of his incredible combat prowess and later on magical power, but also because he's a resilient person. So when you see him struggling, you see him saying, I can't do this, I just want to give up, you're reading it and you're rooting for him. You're saying, you can do this, you can do this. And in the most recent book, The Rhythm of War, we get some more focus on Kaladin again, and once again, without giving too much away, he really comes into his own and delivers in several different ways. Kaladin really is just, in my opinion, a consummate hero, somebody to really look up to and somebody to really root for strongly, someone who is way more powerful than he ever realizes, and that, I think, is a really admirable trait in a protagonist. So if you haven't read the Stormlight archive, I highly recommend it, especially that first book, The Way of Kings, and I imagine that you will fall as in love with Kaladin as I have. All right, now we're on to number 3. Again, these are in no particular order. Number 3 for me is Locke Lamora from the Gentleman Bastards series by Scott Lynch. This is a new read for me. I just finished reading those 3 books in the Gentleman Bastards series, which is planned to be a 7-book series. I read the first 3 that are out and finished that 3rd one, I think, in early February, maybe. The first book is called The Lies of Locke Lamora. Highly recommend it. It's really interesting. It's all crime related. The series revolves around crime, and there's very little magic in the series, actually. It kind of doesn't find its way into the series until more than halfway through the first book. Simply put, It's in a fictional city that is kind of similar to Venice, Italy. With regards to the way things are named, the names that people have are reminiscent of Italian. Also, the fact that kind of rivers run through the city, it's kind of a chain and a grouping of islands, so to speak. Locke, we start off and he's a little kid. He's maybe 5 or 6 years old and he's an orphan. He gets found by a man whose job it is to find abandoned kids and bring them in and help him steal, right? That's basically what he's doing, is he's a crime lord for young people. He finds Locke, and Locke has an unusual proclivity for theft. You know, with most kids, you would have to teach them how to do it. You have to teach them, like, this is why we steal, this is how we do it. But Locke, basically, it's like in his blood, more or less, is what they say at the beginning of the story. Eventually, Locke finds himself in with Father Chains, who runs his own little criminal enterprise. You get the impression right away from the very beginning of the book, and especially as it moves on, that Locke is just a brilliant thief, and mainly just because it's like he's born to do it, and it's just a part of him, right? So it's really fun to read a protagonist who is a thief not by necessity in any way, but because he loves doing it. He's just a good thief. He loves coming up with plots. He loves acting, pretending to be other people. He spends a lot of money on disguises, a lot of money on elaborate ruses to make large sums of money. It's a very, very fun read for that reason. It's also kind of like a buddy series, built around the friendships, between him and his other crime buddies. And the way he interacts with his friends and the way he cares for them is really compelling. So he's a thief, so he obviously values getting over on people, doing whatever he can do to make extra money, but he cares so deeply about his community, his buddies, the Gentleman Bastards, where the name comes from, that's really endearing. Particularly his relationship with his best friend, Jean Tannen, is really fun to read. The series is just so well written. It's so clever. There's so many twists and turns, as you would expect from a series that's crime-related. Locke, similar to Kvothe, is someone I would say is a little shit, or a pain in the ass sometimes. He's very intense. He likes to, mouth off at people that he shouldn't, which is always really fun to read when he's in a situation where he's clearly disadvantaged and he's so mad that he just doesn't care and just starts mouthing off until he gets told one way or another, shut up, Just super fun to read somebody who's like that, somebody who's very intense, somebody who's very passionate about what they do, and that thing happens to be stealing. I just find that really funny and unique. I've never read anything else like that. So if you're looking for a protagonist who's funny and quirky and really passionate in an unusual way, I highly recommend reading the Gentleman Bastards series. All right, the last two protagonists I want to talk about are both from A Song of Ice and Fire, a.k.a. Game of Thrones. I'm going to be talking about these two protagonists mostly with regards to the books, not as much the television show, because the book series, as most of you probably know, is not yet finished. So the first one I want to talk about is Jon Snow. Very cliche for me to say that Jon Snow is one of my favorite protagonists from Game of Thrones, but again, similar to Kaladin Stormblessed from the Stormlight Archive, George just did such an incredibly great job filling that hero archetype beautifully. I think one thing that really sums up why I love Jon Snow so much is how far he has come, his journey, right? If you look back in the very beginning of the story, for those of you who aren't familiar, Jon Snow is the bastard son of Eddard Stark, who is a lord. He is the warden of the North, the Northern Kingdom, which is one of the actually 8 kingdoms in Westeros. He's a bastard son of Ned, so he doesn't have any claim to anything. He's one of 6 children. He kind of feels like he's been left out, and he decides, I want to join the Night's Watch. A similar thing you could equate that to is like joining the military in the real world, but the Night's Watch is for life, and it's very intense, and it's not quite as glamorous as he thought it might be. He eventually does join the Night's Watch pretty shortly into the show. A lot of other things happen, a lot of things go south, but Jon basically comes into his own as a member of the Night's Watch, eventually becomes the leader of the Night's Watch. Jon, his defining characteristic to me, and one of the main reasons I love him so much as a protagonist, is because he doesn't want power. He has no desire for power. He's made that very clear many times, especially in the show, but definitely in the books as well. He wants to do what's right. He wants to live his life and, be kind to others and do well unto others. And that's why I think he makes such an exceptionally good leader. The other thing I love about that is George is realistic, too. That's one thing I love about all of George's characters and all the things that happen to him. It's always so realistic. Jon grew up, the bastard son, admittedly, but still the son of a lord of Westeros. So he has great skill with a blade, exceptional leadership skills from seeing his father, who was a very, very upstanding person, leading, an entire kingdom. He has all these inherent skills that make for a good leader because he's been trained in them. He's just not born all of a sudden able to be a good leader. That's not how leadership works, right? But he doesn't desire leadership, and in a way that makes him kind of the best person to have it, because he's not going to be power hungry. He's not going to, try to push others down so that he can get more, like a lot of people in this series do. Jon is a really exceptionally well-realized hero, in my opinion. And my fifth, again, not in order, but the fifth protagonist that I love, again from Game of Thrones, is Daenerys Targaryen. I think while Game of Thrones is a combination of so many viewpoints, so many things happening with a bunch of different characters, to me, if I was forced to boil it down to two main points, those points to me would be Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen. I absolutely love those two characters so deeply. The only thing in the entire television series, Game of Thrones, that made me cry, I won't say what scene it was, but was the scene with Daenerys Targaryen. And not a particularly sad scene either, but just one that really was a culmination of her arc and her story. Daenerys had to flee her home as a baby. She doesn't even remember it, really. She is trying to make her way in a continent that she knows nothing about with her brother, who is a horrible person, gets thrust into a marriage with a terrifying man that she knows nothing about, and kind of goes through so many trials to eventually become just the most badass woman in the world, basically. She has 3 dragons. That's not much of a spoiler. It technically is for the end of book 1 or the end of season 1 if you're watching the show, but I mean, you all know there's dragons in it. Come on. She has 3 dragons, and obviously those give her a lot of power and weight because they're the only dragons in Westeros. But she, as a person, has just gained so much confidence and so much strength as the show moves forward, being really, really kind and generous with people in need, and also being incredibly cruel to those who have been cruel to others. She's a very interesting character in that regard, and her moral compass, many would argue, is one way or the other. And that's one reason why I think a lot of people were upset by the end of the show. I won't say anything about that. All I will say is, for me, her ending specifically in the show, I actually really liked. Her moral compass is not as clear as someone like Jon Snow, for example, who's clearly just like the good guy. I think maybe him and Kaladin are the only two on this list who are just very much like good person all the time doing the right thing, which really make them archetypal heroes, I would say. Daenerys is so interesting because her reasoning for her cruelness and her insanity, it seems, toward certain people, it makes a lot of sense. That's kind of the crazy part. You're watching it and you're like, I can see why you did that, even though it's some dark shit. It's Game of Thrones, it's pretty dark. But she is just so interesting to watch. She's the only one of the protagonists that I've mentioned whose story has brought me to tears. It's incredibly powerful. She's such a lovely, lovable character, and you really see her come from like nothing and rise up to an extreme level of power and influence in the same way that Jon Snow does, but on opposite sides of the world in 2 completely different contexts, which is one of the main things I love about Game of Thrones, is that specific growth and kind of converging toward the middle. In the book series, we've yet to see those 2 meet, but we know that that's coming eventually. So those are my 5 protagonists. I'll say them one more time. That's Kvothe from the Kingkiller Chronicle, Kaladin Stormblessed from the Stormlight Archive, Locke Lamora from the Gentleman Bastards series, and both Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen from A Song of Ice and Fire, aka Game of Thrones. Hope you guys like watching this video. If any of you enjoyed it and you want me to talk about anything else, just let me know. And I hope you all have a lovely rest of your week. Thanks for watching.